Hello, headphone mixers. My name is Paul Third, and that man across from me is Emrah Celik, an award-winning mix and mastering engineer with over 3 billion streams to his name, with 90% of those mixes being done on headphones. So, this week we are going to dive very deep and hopefully answer all of the questions. We might not be able to answer them all, but we will try and answer as much as we can. So, EQ'ing headphones. Why is EQ'ing headphones really important for mixing and mastering? Now, there are kind of a few reasons, but I'll give you a few very quickly. So, one of the main things that you need to understand when you're trying to choose a headphone for mixing and mastering, one thing you need to be aware of is that we live in a consumer world. And unfortunately, headphones aren't really made for mixing and mastering. Even though they'll say studio, most of all of them have what we call a hi-fi curve. And a hi-fi curve is made more for consumers. So when you play music back on these headphones, they have a certain timbre, a certain characteristic. They have a set sound. Because if you think about it, if all headphones sounded the same and performed the same, we wouldn't have as many headphones as we have, and many people would stop making headphones. So all headphones have a sound, and there isn't really a set headphone that we found that is absolutely perfect off the bat for mixing and mastering. So what we find is that by EQing your headphones to a set target, now the target is subjective. We have talked earlier in a previous video all about Harman and why we recommend Harman as a starting point. Emrah has his own engineer target that he's been working on for a couple of years now. I use it and it works great. We can't talk about it yet. Hopefully one day we'll be able to talk about it. But to kind of get you into the notion of EQing your headphones, what we'll do is we'll talk about kind of certain apps that you can use. We'll talk about certain kind of things that you shouldn't do when you EQ your headphones, and we'll explain why. And we'll cover a little bit of science as well. So Emrah, to kind of start off, just so we don't kind of blow people's minds off already, can you think of a few things that you shouldn't do? Maybe many mistakes or many misconceptions that people have when they EQ their headphones?
So first of all, you have to pick a pair of good headphones that can handle EQ. You know, we have tested a lot of headphones together. We come to a conclusion that some headphones can't handle low end especially. And to me, as a mixing engineer, low end is most important thing when mixing on headphones, because you're going to hear mids, you're going to hear highs. You know, those interactions with highs and mids, speakers and headphones are not so different. But what really different is low-end interaction with you sitting in the front of two big speakers and using headphones, because low-end is going to be very different. For example, HD650s has very steep low-end.
Yeah, the roll off, yeah.
Roll off,
right. Yeah.
It rolls off very steep, and it's not okay to boost it for 10 dB to get that sub sound, because it's going to produce distortion, or it's going to be very limited headroom when you crank the volume.
Actually, something that I think is very important to talk about quickly is if you are looking at trying to find these measurements, a good place to start is auto EQ. So if you go to auto EQ, you just type in auto EQ into Google. There's also an app you can download as well for your phone, Android and iPhone as well. And the great thing with that is it's got a massive database of mostly like all headphones. Modern ones, you know, it depends who picks them up. But what we do advise that if you are looking at a measurement on auto EQ, we do advise you go for Auditory 1990. The reason that we advise to use Auditory is for consistency. Auditory 1990 uses the Grass measurement system, and he is mostly well known for being very consistent in his measurements, so that you will probably find many other measurement people on there. However, you will find that some of them are maybe using cheaper measurement rigs that aren't that trusted. So if you are trying to find a headphone, go to Auto EQ, type it in, and if you can, they normally tell you on the right-hand side who measured it, and then you'll be able to see off the bat if it's close to Harman. Because what you need to be aware of on Auto EQ is that if you use Auditory, the target that they have is Harman. You might use or go to somebody else that's got another measurement, but they might use a different target. So there's different targets. There's sometimes, an auto EQ target, or somebody else has another preference target. We are focusing mostly on Harman. So auto EQ, Auditory 1990. Emrah, I'll let you continue.
When you're going to EQ headphones, just make sure don't EQ from 10K and up, because this is where your hi-hats, this is where your air is there, right? But if you have to use, narrow cues and notches, and you're going to see a lot of dips there, this is because there's a relation between your ear canal and the outside of your ear, pinna, it's called, have a relation with the headphones, and headphones also has some acoustic, reflections.
Mm-hmm.
And those very dips are actually there for a purpose. It's going to take down the resonances, because you're not going to hear it as very deep, because your ears is going to compensate it. That's why it's very important to make things sound good from 10K and down, low end, mid-range, and upper mid-range. This is where mixing is, because hi-hats, very high frequencies, they are not so musical either. It's just the air that you hear. But the most important thing is that make sure your mid-range and bass is right, and upper mid-range is right. Vocal and ear gain, if you look at the Harman target, you're going to see a very big bump there. This is where your ear canal is, and it's very different in people. But actually, it's better that I show you a graph on the screen and show the details, actually, why I'm recommending to not EQ from the 10K and up. It's better, right?
Yeah.
So if I take the graph right there, the graph you see on the screen, it's from FIIO FT1-Pro. It's good example to show how to EQ. So you see from 150 Hz and down, you see there's kind of 5 dB difference that you can EQ, because the FIIO FT1-Pro can produce very low frequencies. It goes really deep to 20 Hz. It can handle that kind of boost, a low shelf boost. And you see in the from 250 and up to 5K is relatively close to target, and those areas is not going to matter too much. But if you look at the 1.K and 2000 Hertz, you see there's a dip, which is mostly where ear gain is, compensate these areas, but you don't want to boost it too much or too with very narrow Q. And also from 2K to 6K, it's going to sound very bright. But you don't have to take those little spikes down one by one. Instead, I will add from 3K to 6K a very wide Q and just slightly take it down a few dB, because you don't want to mess up with the relation between those peaks. It's the nature of headphones. And you see there's a 10K, there's really deep, and this is the resonance. You don't want to EQ that. So just leave it there. If you want to add some air, you can just slightly add high shelf. Or if you think it's too airy, you can just take down a few dB on the high shelf. This is very simple. And just make sure that you focus on, especially between 6K and 30 Hertz. If you make this EQ correct on this area, your headphones are going to sound pretty good and ready for mixing. But as I told you, there are limitations from headphones to headphones.
Now, something that the internet is already going to be working, there'll be people working, typing, bashing away at their keyboards. One thing I get all the time is, Harman is a preference target. We're meant to be mixing engineers. And why are we using a preference target for audio files? Blah, 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 blah. Right. Harman has been tested. Me and Emrah have used Harman. Many other people have used Harman. As soon as I made that video talking about why I advise using the Harman curve for mixing, so many people started using it, and they were talking about how good their translation was. Yes, there is an element of preference to Harman, but it's more in the low end. That's where the preference is. The scientific research of Harman is more about trying to get headphones to be tonally akin to speakers in a well-treated room. The only thing that's kind of preference and average is in the low end, where that low end is. Some people may be a little bit more sensitive to low end, but what we do advise, and this is where people struggle, right? If you use Harman as a start off, right, a starting point, use your translation, your mixes, to tell you if it's too much bass or too little bass. That's again dependent on ear to ear. But Harman is a very good starting point, and I normally find that when I do EQ to Harman, even in the low end, normally it gets it bang on. If I need to take it down, I could maybe take it down a dB, but it's never really, really varying from that. But again, use your ears, and again, use your translation. And again, always make sure that when you do mixes, again, if you can get a pair of speakers, again, test the translation to speakers. If it's too much, the speakers will tell you. And then all you need to do is just go backwards and forwards. I always recommend some people to take your headphones into a studio with speakers, hopefully good speakers, but it probably doesn't matter too much, but a very, very, very well-treated room. The room is the most important. If you walk into somebody's studio with your headphones, and then you could, again, with your laptop or whatever, and, just have your EQ in there, and then listen backwards and forwards to the same song on their speakers, and then on your headphones, it'll give you a good representation of tonally if it's accurate. And then from there, you could play about with crossfeed and stuff like that, and other things that we spoke about last week. But yeah, just to make it clear for all the internet bashers, Harman is something that me and Emrah advise because it is more akin tonally to speakers in a room. Me and Emrah have mixed on it, and we have found that translation is very good to speakers. So just thought I'd get that out the way. So we've discussed kind of how you can EQ your headphones and certain things to look out for. A big thing I get all the time, Emrah, is phase. Now this is anybody that's kind of like on the edge of this conversation already have switched off. I'm done. Fuck, I just want to EQ my headphones. If you want to do that, go to Auto EQ and go to Harman and try and live your best life. But just right, if before you leave, right, just please take this consideration. When we advise mixing headphones, we never advise linear phase. Linear phase may make sense to many people because people are like, well, yeah, I don't want to mess up the balance of the headphones. I just want it to be like the same phase. So if I use linear phase, I can just change the tonal balance and that makes sense. We do not advise linear phase. We advise minimum phase. Now, Emrah is better because every time I try to explain this to somebody online, I always think I don't get it spot on. Emrah, could you advise exactly why, some of the science behind why we need to use minimum phase and not linear phase when EQing our headphones?
Yeah, we can go pretty deep, but I'm not going to do that. We can get pretty nerdy about it, but
yeah, that's for the Discord.
That's for the Discord. You know, there is no linear phase in analog domain, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is no linear phase in analog domain. And headphones like these are analog devices. So these have already, when they have a frequency response, it means that it has a phase response too, right? From the low end. If you don't change the phase, and if you keep it as linear, you're going to break the sound. Simple. Very simple. You have to fix the phase as well, because it's not just, you don't get that low end or high piercing sound because of how they sound. There's also phase involved in this analog domain, and you have to make sure that you fix the phase as well. The only way to fix phase is to use natural phase or minimum phase, not linear phase. So it's going to be a counter EQing inclusive phase as well. That's it.
So when you're thinking about EQing, right, in phase, minimum phase, just minimum phase. Don't even get yourself into debates with linear phase and all. But there's another filter in there that's like such and such fancy EQ. No, just use honestly stock standard EQ. You don't need Pro Q3. You don't need Kirchhoff. Honestly, stock standard EQ will do the job. The most important thing to bear in mind is how many bands that you need. So this will bring me on to the next point. So I talk about it all the time, and I've talked about it on my channel quite a lot, about not using a lot of bands. That's one of the reasons why I don't advise SonarWorks, and there's a video on why I don't advise SonarWorks and their target and their correction method. And that's also the reason why I use ARC 4 for my speaker correction, because it uses less bands and it's narrow in its approach. So as Emrah talked about earlier, about we'd never ever really want to use lots of big narrow notches, especially close together, because we can get phase distortion. And when you get phase distortion, then you're smearing your image, and then you're getting yourself away from what's important, which is the original source. So when you're EQing, there isn't a exact number, right? I know you want there to be. I can't say 3, I can't say 5. It depends on the headphones a lot of times. But what we do advise is that you use the least amount that's physically possible. Emrah normally says to me, try not go above 10. But if you have an headphone that does need 11 for whatever reason, then use 11. But we do normally advise to keep that down. Now, Emrah, could you explain to people why we advise to use the least amount of bands possible?
So as I just show people the frequency response of FT1-Pro, you see there are a lot of variations. You know, it's not perfect line following the target, but those are the character of the headphones that you don't want to mess up. It doesn't have to be perfectly follow. You know, just connect the dots without following the dips and ups and all the small details.
Like what SonarWorks does, yeah, because SonarWorks is the best example to describe this. So what SonarWorks does with its speakers and also with its headphones is it mirror corrects. So it's got a target, and every deviation is perfectly corrected. So you can have, so many people will think it's perfect, but it's not, because again, especially if it's narrow and they're close together, you get phase distortions, and as Emrah said, you move away from the character of the headphone. So we're wanting to keep the character of the headphone. So what we need to think about is, right, how could we do that in the least amount of moves? And how you do that is by just getting close to the target. You don't overanalyze it. Don't think you need to be perfect. There are sometimes I've seen that many people will take convolutions of certain things from auto EQ, and they'll be like, yeah, but if I use this convolution, it gets absolutely perfect to the line. I'm like, yeah, but what you don't realize is that within that convolution, there could be maybe fucking 20, 30 bands. You don't know how many bands there is. Where if you set the bands, then you are in control yourself. And then if you use the least amount of bands, then it's more natural sounding.
It's kind of sweet spot is around 4 or 5 bands. And more than that, it's just unnecessary, because we are not going to EQ from 10K and up, right? We're just going to use high shelf and low shelf, and in between we can add 3 more bands, and then it will be like 5 bands. It's enough if you pick the right headphones.
Yeah, true.
So if you pick some really shitty headphones and just mess with the frequency response, no EQ is going to fix it.
And that brings me on to another important point, which is what we advise is that instead of trying to get really perfect, just get close and then learn that sound. One of the most important things that people forget is that we've got to learn the sound. So if we get close to Harman, then we learn it. And then we use our own translation that tells us, right, okay, I put too much low mids in that, right, okay, I need to work at that. Every curve will translate differently. So, for example, Emrah, what have you found with Harman over the years? Because when we first got talking about all this years ago, I remember you were using Sundara, and you were using, I think it was only 3 bands you were using with Sundara, and it was to Harman. What was it that you found with Harman and maybe some other targets, translation-wise? Were there some issues in some of the targets that you found? Or, what's been your experiences with some of the targets?
I probably tested all of them. Harman target, Sound Guy, PQDB, Artings, SonarWorks, and everything. Almost every target I tried. From some really hi-fi, popular hi-fi guys, their preferences and everything. Nothing sounded translated good. They sounded good, but translate, it doesn't work for us as engineer. The issue with Harman target, it's bright.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And Its low end is a bit, meaty low end. It has really meaty low end. And, if you hear things already meaty, you wouldn't add meat, right, to the low end. Or if things are too bright, you'll dull maybe it, it's kind of counterattack what you hear.
Yeah, because I know what you mean.
You attack you mix the song as a counter EQing, right? So if it's too bright, it has to be a little bit. The things you hear must be a little bit dull, and the low end doesn't have to be that much bump. And we also need a little FIIO dB low mid bumps from as an engineer, because if you hear low mid bumps, you're gonna take it down, and it's gonna sound very cohesive and very cool when the songs translate. That's the most important thing. And targets are, as I said, starting point.
Yeah.
It's not going to get you 100%. It's going to get you 85, 90%.
What's your thoughts on the low mid dip in Harman? Because I've always found sometimes I'm always unsure sometimes if I've maybe been on occasion where it's maybe a little bit too much and you kind of let the low mids kind of in a little bit. Do you think that that's something that is maybe, I always found that's the only thing sometimes. Yeah, it could be a little bit bright, but I can still make it work if I use references, which again are really, really important. Again, always use references. But I do always find that sometimes I could always do with a little maybe bit more low mid in regards to what I hear when I'm listening to speakers. What's been your thoughts on that kind of low mid side of Harman?
Yeah, just show me a song that you take down 360 hertz FIIO dB and it didn't sound good.
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
so totally, yeah, 100%.
If you EQ as a counter on your headphones, add just 360 hertz a little bit, just a few dB, because Harman will guide you to add more low mid.
Yeah, well,
because of that dip. It's a personal thing. Fix things the way you go, the way you mix. The more you mix, the more you're gonna learn about how it translates.
Correct, and it's the exact same as speakers. So I've always got this thing where Ed's a drummer. My good friend Ed Thorne, that I did the Work on Audio Tools podcast with. He's a drummer. He's less sensitive to the high end than me. So when I'm in speakers, I always, even on these PMCs, I've had to bring down the shelf by, 2.6? I think maybe 2.5 dB high shelf on the PMCs because they were too bright for me. But again, somebody else might come and Ed would come in and go, these are maybe a bit dull. So there's a lot of preference in there, and that's what you have to learn. You have to learn where your ear is. Now, many people, Emrah, will talk, and this is where it can get a little bit confusing. Now, I tend not to think about this, because if you go too deep in the woods, I think that you do kind of lose yourself. You can't see the forest for the trees. Many people talk about an HRTF, which is a head-related transfer function. And many people say that what that does is it then helps you get a better balance that's more akin to your ear. Obviously, that's something that we don't do. We just learn. We get close to Harman, we learn that sound, then we use our translation. That's almost our HRTF, is it, Emrah, really?
Yeah.
As our translation.
Yeah, because, your ear gain and mine is going to be different. That's why with time you start mixing and adjusting small things on the way to get that perfect sound out of your headphones.
Now, this is the part of the episode where we did allude to this last week. Now, Emrah was doing a little bit of experimenting. Now, many people will talk to us about the type of EQ that we use now, because you can use a parametric EQ, you can use a graphic EQ, and there is another form of EQ that I mentioned earlier, which is convolution. Now, originally, before Emrah did his tests, if you would have told me that there was any difference between a standard parametric stock DAW EQ and importing that same kind of EQ bands and or exporting that into a convolution, there would be a difference, I would have told you you're absolutely a nut job and you should go watch AP Mastering or something like that. But actually, there is a difference between a parametric EQ and a convolution EQ. Emrah, the floor is yours. Wow the audience.
Yeah, I was shocked as well, because I couldn't believe that would be true. I thought it's a bullshit. But if you go deep and measure deeply, you hear the difference, especially on the high ends, and the response is faster compared to EQ. The ringing is post EQ ringing is less than normal EQ. That's the good part of using convolution. But convolution, there's an EQ response, right? On the convolution. And it has to be also as less as possible. So in upcoming videos, we can show how to create, you can take an EQ and create impulse response out of it. And you're going to put that on a software like Convolution Easy, and that will be your headphone correction. But we can show it later.
Yeah. So just we'll leave a link in the description for anybody that knows Convolution Easy. It is a free plugin, and if you want to get down that whole thing about creating an impulse response from an EQ and do it yourself, we'll leave a link to that down below because it is free. But Emrah, very quickly, can you tell people the main benefits of what we found? Now, Emrah has very bespoke software. Okay, nobody else has got access to it, and what it allows him to do, it allows him to tell numerically all of the differences between two audio files. And if there is a difference, it will give you a numerical value. And he took both EQs, printed the files, and what we found was that there was a difference in the transient response. Now, what was the percentage in regards to the difference? Explain that to some people, just so if anybody's unsure of the software.
Yeah, me and my dear friend has created a software to AB software, and it measures the difference between two audio files. This software has an amazing algorithm that you just can't fail it. If it says there is a difference as a percentage, it says 100%. So I have to trust it because the algorithm cannot be failed. This is how accurate this is. So it says the difference between impulse response and EQ is 100%. And I can AB and I can pass, blind test. So,
and just so people like that haven't tried this out, Emrah, what is the main difference that you heard? What was it about the convolution versus the parametric that made you pass the blind test? What is it you were hearing? What were the main differences between the two that you were hearing?
Mostly transient and the speed and the highs, especially high end.
Now, again, Emrah sent me the files and I did the test, and the transients were what we noticed. Now, if you zoom in, Emrah done this in the Isotope RX, and we were able to actually see the differences physically with the transient response, and the transient response was different. We'll leave an image here on the screen just so you can see the difference between the two files. So in regards to speed, there is a difference. I can't tell you why. This is the thing. I was like, Emrah, how is this possible? Could you tell? Have you figured out why that is, Emrah? Or are we just at the point where we're like, that's the difference, that's what it does, move on?
I have to really go deeply and check and test everything to say something, but I don't have the answer yet. But I'm investing in it. And, I'm studying the neural amp modeling as well. Mm-hmm. That would be an interesting point as well in future.
Yeah, totally.
So instead of using impulse response, EQ, we will use neural amp modeling to correct headphones. That would be amazing.
Crazy. That's where it's going, isn't it? That is where it's going.
This is what I'm studying right now. And I can explain later in here the findings that I found. But, you don't have to use impulse response.
Yeah.
Let's wrap this up, right? If you use auto EQ, just don't trust it 100%. It's just starting point. Or Squeak Link, we can link the link.
Yeah, we'll leave all links in the description, yeah.
And just check the oratory's measurements. And there's also for system-wide on Mac, because I don't use Windows, so you can explain which software it is. But on Mac, you can use Sound Source that coming with a lot of headphones correction. Basically, it's built-in auto EQ in the little app. And there's also another app called, this is for made headphone corrections. It's called EQMac.app. It's relatively cheap, just 30 euro per year, or just 40 for full license. So you don't have to pay more. These are coming with built-in 6,000 profiles, EQ profiles. And you can pick one and maybe you will feel great, and you just can then manually adjust everything. If you're using Mac, use EQ Mac app or Sound Source to fix everything, and then start from there and build your perfect headphones by EQing them. EQ is the top tier in the list when it comes to mixing. The correction of the EQ is the most important thing, but that comes after the headphones.
Correct.
Yeah.
So Emrah's covered Mac there. In regards to Windows users, there is Equalizer APO that I've used in the past. That works great. And that I think that's got the same as what Emrah was talking about. It's got auto EQ profiles on there, but you can download impulse responses and convolutions or whatever and import that. But I'm pretty sure there's a feature on there where it's already got a lot of stuff built in there. So you've got that system wide. I use RealPhones, so for D-Sneak, RealPhones is a plugin I use for third-party checks. So it's great for making headphones sound like they're in a room, or like recreating speakers, blah blah blah. But they've also got a built-in EQ, so they've got 3 custom EQs that you could make, and they work perfectly with auto EQ as well. And there are other few things as well. So I've got topping, in regards to DSP, I've got a topping D93 discrete, and I could use topping tune. I'll leave a link in the description because it's really cool what it can do. You can import a target, the frequency response, and you can EQ to the target and have the DSP on your unit. You don't need to touch it. You don't need any software. It's amazing. RME with the ADI2 Pro FS, Emrah has that. Many bands of EQs that got, Emrah? 7 or more?
7 bands. 7
bands, and it's nearly like unlimited presets, isn't it? Like this ridiculous amount of presets that RME give you. So there are hardware options as well. Audient Aurea, you can do that with Audient Aurea as well, as long as you've got, the way it works with Aurea is if you have a headphone amp, you can select a certain output to have a certain EQ. Say if it was output 3 and 4, you would send that out to your headphone amp, and then you would then EQ that output, and that would be on the headphone, blah, blah, blah. So there are lots of options to EQ on the way in. Now, a few kind of caveats that I'll try and think about from the top of my head, because there's going to be questions, Emrah, that we've missed. So, in regards to the Pro Q3 thing, you have to multiply the Q. The reason that is because Pro Q uses biquad filters. Now, and Pro Q is very kind of unique in that. Most stock DAW EQs are going to be absolutely fine, and you're going to be able to import from auto EQ. So you can generally just take the Q and take the gain and the frequencies, blah, 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 and that should work. Are there any EQs, Emrah, that you know off the top of your head that are biquad filters, or you may have to do a calculation for the Q factor?
No, there are EQs from Voxengo that uses BW, bandwidth, instead of quality. So that's a different calculation. But I would simply, you have to multiply 1.41.
Yeah, for Pro Q3, yeah.
For Pro Q3. And I would simply not use it because it's just complicated.
I know what you mean.
The things you read on the Q value, you have to multiply your calculation and everything. Just use a simple stock AQ, DAC AQ, and re-AQ, or if you are using Reaper. And a stock AQ will work because they have enough bands.
Yeah, and it's just really about the bands. So don't be afraid of, because at the end of the day, right, like for anybody that's never watched me on my channel, I can get Pro Q3 to fucking null with a stock digital EQ. A linear EQ is a linear EQ. They will null, right? If you get the exact same Q factor and the right gain, and it'll just, like, it's just science, okay? It's ones and zeros at the end of the day when it comes to stuff like that with linear EQs. So yeah, you don't need to worry about that. That's the only plugin that you need to worry about. And it is genuinely as simple as taking the Pro Q3 Q, multiplying that by 1.41, and that's what's going to get you the correct Q factor. So if it's a Q factor of 1, what you'll do is you'll times that by 1.41, and that'll be your Q factor for Pro Q3. Okay? That's what you do. Simple. But yeah, to keep it simple, normally we do advise just use a stock digital EQ. EQ is so important, and it's important to understand why you need it, because as I said earlier, all headphones have a sound. Some headphones are tuned in a way that they are very hard to EQ. These, for example, the Hyphamins and Dara closed. Jesus, I would never advise these for mixing. Me and Emrah included. Yeah, they're decent for tracking and stuff, but like, yeah, it's to EQ them and then try to get them for mixing. It's a nightmare. Some EQs take EQ well, some don't. A lot of dynamic headphones won't take EQ that well. Bare dynamics do not take EQ well, especially in the low end. If you're stuck, you can go to someplace like Audio Science Review and see if Emir's done a test of the headphones. He normally has headphone measurements and he has distortion measurements. However, what's very, very, very important to understand is that Emrah does stress test. So like the minimum distortion level he has is 94 dB SPL, which is incredibly loud. Just be aware that if, the headphone that you have doesn't have the sub bass, if it's rolling off, you kind recreate what's in it, right? If you try and get something like the Sony MDR7506, which genuinely doesn't have any low end and high end, if you try, and I've tried it, if you try and boost the shit, right, out of the high EQ, if you try and get air out of a 7506, nothing will happen. You can boost 15 dB in the top end. You won't hear anything because it doesn't produce it. You can't reproduce what it doesn't make in the first place. But what you are going to have is the offset of, say, like if it's a shelf or a big bell, whatever it does make, you're going to be boosting that. And then especially with those, Jesus, I remember I tried it to Harman and it was funny. I just made them like brighter in the ear gain region and they just sounded terrible. No, I was the opposite way. I ended up dulling them. So because they don't produce the top end, I dulled the ear gain bit, but because it didn't have the top end, it just sounded incredibly dull. And that's what's important to understand, is that you want your headphones to be full bandwidth. That's the reason that we recommend planars quite a lot, because planars normally do a very good low end response. Dynamic drivers normally struggle. You will find they roll off. In regards to headphones for EQing, normally planars are the best, normally, but you're looking for low distortion. Hyphamin and Nanos, take it beautifully. Most Hyphamins do EQ really well. Odysseys take EQ like an absolute champ. Actually, Emrah, are there any budget options that you could say off the top of your head that are quite good for taking EQ? I knew you were going to do that. FT1-Pro. And how much is that retailing for?
It's just $200 or something.
$200. Honestly, he's been raving about it because of the price. And it's closed back as well, isn't it? Those ones.
No, it's open back. Open back planar magnet.
But the closed back, they take EQ quite well as well, don't they?
Yeah, they are good.
Yeah,
they are good. Both, but they are dynamic.
Yeah.
So dynamics are punchy. Yeah, but they don't have sub mostly.
Yeah. And also take the distortion measurements with a grain of salt, because what me and Emrah have found is that, especially with the Hyphamin egg-shaped cups, if you go, for example, onto the Ananda Nanos that are very, very, very low distortion because they use a nanometer thickness diaphragm, we know, you can just hear it, how low distortion it is. But due to Emir not getting a very good fit on his grass measurement system with the egg-shaped cups, what happens is it actually shows quite a lot of distortion in the upper mid-range. And many people were going daft and they were like, oh my God, no, I can't do that because of this distortion graph. So take distortion graphs with a pinch of salt and always use your ears, right? Emrah, is there any test for anybody that, say, if they've got like a cheap headphone, budget headphone, dynamic headphone, whatever it is there any test for them that you could advise to know if your headphone takes EQ well? Because I'm just thinking what people are going to ask. That's probably the last one people are going to ask, is X headphone good for EQ, and can X headphone get EQ'd? Is there any tests that you could advise for people to do this?
What I do, when I test the low end, I play sine wave sweep on the low end and boost 10 dB. And just, sweep between 20 hertz to 150 hertz and see if I can still hear the pure sine wave tone.
That's a great example.
Or it's just if you add in some kind of saturation plugin to distort the hell out of it, it will rattle pretty badly. You're gonna hear the distortion. I mean, if you know what distortion is, you're gonna hear it.
Yeah, so the sine sweep is really a really good test to do. Another thing for me is just to kind of wrap up on why this is important, why we talk about low ends and why it's so important, is because the way that you see low end on a visualizer, right, for example in Pro Q3, isn't the way that the headphones receive it, because we're dealing with acoustic sound. So the way that our ears work is that we are less sensitive to low end and we are more sensitive, as Emrah talked about, the pin gain, the ear gain. The way that acoustic sound works for how we receive it is that we are more, we perceive the upper mid-range a lot more. That's why a 1K sine tone is used quite a lot for measurements, because that's normally, the frequency that we're most perceptible to. But in regards to headphones, in regards to making distortion, when you have a track, you could look at it and say, oh yeah, it looks quite flat. That's not the way the headphones receive it. They receive it the way that the acoustic sound actually is in the real world, not with our ears, because this isn't a pair of ears. This is mechanical, okay? So they receive that low end, full low end, right? And what you need to understand is that, especially if you're dealing with really bass, heavy, subby genres, that's a lot of low end energy. And the energy in acoustic sound is always in the lows. So the most energy is in the lows, and that's what stresses out your headphones the most. So the sine wave test is really, really good. Or again, just test on a few really... Have you got any songs, Emrah, you would advise people to test for like really low subby kind of stuff? And maybe some popular stuff that people could use?
There are some Drake songs you can test. Maybe I can share my Spotify list.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll leave a link in the description down below.
That would be great.
Yeah. So yeah, those are the main things that we could think of, and I've tried to cover as much. I know we've not. I think they'll probably be like the odd thing, but I think we have covered really everything that you need to know. We've given you a few examples of how you can test to know if your headphone takes EQ well. But honestly, I know it's many of you don't want to hear. So you tell me you have to sell my dynamic headphones? No, there are some dynamic headphones that are good, but you need to do the testing. This is what me and Emrah will always tell you. Me and Emrah, it's this old saying, right? You can take a horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. We can take you to the water, but we can't make you drink, right? You've got to do the testing. You've got to get your headphones. You've got to take our advice. You've got to get the measurements. You've got to test them. Again, use the sine wave sweep. Again, listen. Crank the headphone up. That's another thing. If you're not cranking your headphone enough and you're not listening at proper levels, you're never really going to know if the headphone is actually distorting or it's not. But we'll cover listening levels in another episode. So yeah, Emrah, I think that's it. You could hear maybe autistic brain rattling to see if I covered everything. I think that's it. So yeah, hopefully it's been a good video for you. Again, leave your questions down below. My name's Paul Third. That's Emrah Celik.
Yeah.
And we will see you next week on another instalment of MixPhones.